in the farthest reaches of known space, beyond the great nebulae and uncharted black holes, a small human colony struggled to thrive. This colony, named New Dawn, had been established on the edge of the HFY star system, a region that had been under the peaceful control of an alien species for centuries. The HFY, an advanced and wise race, had long held sway over the system, guiding the many species that populated its planets. Their existence was quiet, ordered, and civil, and they had welcomed humanity's first steps into the stars. But peace had been shattered when another, far more aggressive race, the Xeric, came into the picture, known throughout the galaxy. For their brutal conquests, the Xeric were a species of invaders who destroyed everything in their path. Unlike the HFY, who valued coexistence, the Xeric had only one desire: domination. New Dawn, a human outpost built with hope and determination, was now under siege. The small human population, scientists, engineers, and settlers had been living peacefully with their alien neighbors for a short time, but that peace was now gone. The Xeric were merciless, attacking the colony without warning their ships. Descending from the sky like thunderclouds, their technology was advanced far beyond anything humanity had ever seen. Each strike from the Xeric annihilated entire sectors of the colony. Buildings that once stood tall and proud were reduced to rubble, and fires ravaged the land, their orange glow casting a grim light on the faces of the colonists. People scrambled for cover as the Xeric's warships fired devastating blasts. Tearing apart the defenses they had worked so hard to build, the human leaders, desperate to save their people, understood one grim truth: they had no chance against the Xeric. The colony's defenses were minimal, and their technology, though advanced in human terms, was laughable compared to the Xeric's weapons of mass destruction. Even the HFY, whose civilizations spanned thousands of years, had no means to combat the Xeric's raw, unstoppable force. In the midst of this despair, the leaders of New Dawn made a fateful decision, one that they hoped would bring salvation, even if it meant the ultimate risk. They decided to send a distress signal to Earth, their home, which had been isolated for years after a great war. Earth had been rebuilding, recovering from internal turmoil and past conflicts, but the hope of a stronger future had always remained in the hearts of its people. New Dawn's leaders hoped that, somehow, humanity's distant home might answer. The call, the message they sent, was filled with desperation and urgency. The tone was sharp, broken with fear, yet full of hope. "We are under attack. The Xeric are destroying everything. We have no defense. Please, send help." The signal would take years to reach Earth, and even if it did, there was no guarantee that any rescue could arrive in time. The colony's survival rested on the edge of a knife, and that knife was swiftly slipping toward the abyss. Back on Earth, the distress signal came as a shock. For years, humanity had turned inward, licking its wounds from the great wars that had nearly torn the planet apart. The government, which had been preoccupied with its own problems, was slow to react. The world was still recovering from years of internal struggle, economic hardship, and environmental disasters. The idea of spacefaring colonies was still new. The notion that humanity's survival might depend on a message sent from the depths of space seemed almost unbelievable. The leaders on Earth debated fiercely. Some believed the Xeric were simply a threat too powerful to defeat. Others argued that this was a chance to prove humanity's strength on the galactic stage. But there was something the Xeric did not understand: humanity's true strength. They had underestimated Earth for centuries. What the invaders saw as weakness, the fragile ecosystems, the unpredictable weather, the chaos of human society, was, in fact, humanity's hidden advantage. Earth was a death world. It was a planet where only the strongest, most adaptable beings survived. The creatures that lived there had learned to endure the harshest conditions: vast deserts that burned in the summer, freezing winters that could freeze a person to death in minutes, dense jungles where life itself seemed hostile to everything. Humanity had faced wars, environmental destruction, and near extinction, and yet it had always bounced back. No alien race had ever truly understood the resilience of humankind. After days of debate, a decision was made. Earth would respond. It would send a team not of diplomats or soldiers with advanced weapons, but of its most skilled and dangerous survivors. Those who had endured the worst conditions on Earth. These were the people who had learned to survive in the most hostile environments, the ones who had adapted when faced with extinction. The Deathworlders, as they were called, were the ultimate survivors, each one having faced challenges that would break even the strongest of other species. They had been trained to fight in environments that were as dangerous as any battlefield. In space, Earth's response would be a force like no other, team of warriors who understood that survival was not just about weapons, but about the will to live, to adapt, to overcome. As the leaders of New Dawn awaited the arrival of help, their situation grew direr with each passing day. Zarek were relentless, and the defenses they had managed to set up were failing one. By one, the colony was losing hope. Yet the message had been sent, and there was still a chance, however slim, that Earth's heroes would arrive in time, in the dark silence of space. As New Dawn's once bright lights flickered and faded, a storm was brewing on the distant homeworld of humanity. The wheels of fate had begun to turn, and Earth's Deathworlders, the last hope of the colony, were already preparing for the journey into the stars. What the Zarek didn't know was that humanity had faced worse and survived through sheer will, grit, and an unshakable belief that no one could take away their future. The call had been sent. The backup was on its way, and the Zarek had no idea what was coming. Back on Earth, the response to the distress signal was immediate, yet far from enthusiastic. The government's officials, caught off guard by the sudden urgency of the message, sat around sleek, polished tables in darkened war rooms. They were unsure of the best course of action. After all, the Zarek were a force unlike any other. Their reputation stretched across the galaxy, brutal, relentless, and seemingly invincible. They were known to conquer entire planets without mercy, leaving nothing behind but ruin and ash. Many of Earth's leaders were doubtful. They questioned if humanity stood any chance against a species so advanced and so destructive. To most of the government, it felt like a fool's hope, a cry for help from an isolated colony that might already be lost. The initial meetings were filled with skepticism. Some argued that sending help was a waste of resources. Others felt the message itself could be a trap. Perhaps the Zarek had lured the humans into a false sense of hope to make the eventual destruction even more complete. Still, the desperation in the message could not be ignored. New Dawn was a human colony, and if Earth did nothing, it would signal the galaxy that humanity was weak. That in itself could be disastrous for Earth's future. The debate stretched on 4 days, but the decision to act was eventually made. Earth would send a response, but not just any response. No. Earth had an answer, one that few would expect. The answer lay in a group of individuals known only to a select few on the planet, the Deathworlders. These were the veterans from Earth's most hostile environments, survivors of wars, disasters, and the world's harshest terrains. Men and women who had been forged in the crucible of Earth's wildest and most unforgiving landscapes, from the freezing tundras of Siberia, where survival meant enduring temperatures so cold that even machines broke down, to the vast Amazon jungles, where predators lurked in every shadow, and every step could be your last, to the blistering heat of the Sahara Desert, where a wrong move meant certain death. These individuals had learned to thrive where no one else could. They had faced the impossible, and through sheer force of will, they had emerged victorious. These were the people Earth would send. The Deathworlders were not ordinary soldiers. They had no need for elaborate armor or the latest technology. They were survivors. They had survived humanity's wars, environmental catastrophes, and nature's cruelest challenges. Their training was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They were experts in tactics, improvisation, and above all, adaptation. While most species relied on high-tech weaponry and sophisticated machinery, the Deathworlders relied on their minds, bodies, and instincts. They knew how to turn any environment into an advantage, no matter how deadly it was. These men and women were Earth's secret weapon, and they were the only hope for New Dawn. Among them was Commander Jacob Hart. Hart was a veteran of Earth's most extreme environments. He had spent years in the harshest corners of the planet, leading missions into places where even the bravest would hesitate to go. He had led expeditions through jungles so thick with poison and parasites that entire squads had collapsed before reaching their destination. He had trained soldiers to survive in temperatures that could freeze the blood in your veins in deserts where the sun would bake you alive. If there was anyone who could face the Xeric and live to tell the tale, it was him. Hart was briefed on the situation as soon as the call was made. The odds were clear new. Dawn was on the brink of annihilation, and the Xeric were an enemy unlike anything Earth had ever encountered. The Deathworlders would be facing not just overwhelming numbers, but a technologically superior force. Still, there was something the Xeric could not account for: humanity's spirit. Commander Hart had been in situations where the odds seemed impossible, but he knew one truth above all else: humans never gave up. No matter how hopeless the fight, humans would always find a way. As the Deathworlders gathered for their final briefing before departure, the reality of the mission began to set in. There was a chance they would never return. The journey to New Dawn would take months, and by the time they arrived, the colony might already be lost. Despite the warnings, Hart saw something in the eyes of his team that made him proud. They were ready. They weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of failing. They understood that they weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future of humanity. They were fighting for a world that had given them everything, and now it was time to give something back. Hart looked out over his team, men and women of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life. Some were former soldiers, others were ex-scientists, engineers, or survival experts. But each one shared a common trait. They had been pushed to the brink of survival and had come back stronger. They had faced death in its many forms and had never flinched. Now they were about to face the Xeric. Before they boarded the ships, Hart spoke to them, his voice steady and strong. "This is going to be tough. We know that. But I have something none of these aliens have, something the Xeric will never. Understand? We have the will to survive, have the will to fight, and we have something they don't: Earth's spirit. They'll throw everything at us, but in the end, they'll learn that humanity is not to be underestimated." With that, the Deathworlders made their final preparations. They boarded their ships, ready for the unknown. The mission would be difficult, maybe impossible. But one thing was certain: Earth's champions were not going down without a fight. They were coming for the Xeric, and they would show the galaxy what it meant to be human. The stars beckoned. And with that, the journey to New Dawn began. The once bustling colony of New Dawn had become a ghost town, streets littered with debris, burning wreckage, and the echoes of desperate cries. The Xeric had breached the outer defenses. It was no longer a question of if they would take the colony, it was a matter of how long the last few survivors could hold out. Each passing hour seemed like a lifetime. The colonists, though brave, had little left to fight with. Their weapons had proven ineffective against the Xeric's devastating firepower. Most of the colony's leaders had been lost in the early stages of the siege, leaving only a handful of survivors to make decisions. Panic had set in. Their homes, their families, their very futures were slipping through their fingers. And no one knew how much longer they could last. It seemed as if hope had abandoned them, and the Xeric would soon reign victorious. But just as despair began to consume the last of the human defenders, a rumble echoed through the ground, distant at first, but growing steadily louder. The sound of something massive approaching. The first ship appeared through the thick smoke-choked atmosphere of New Dawn's skies, cutting through the smoke like a blade. It wasn't like the sleek, imposing ships of the Xerac. It wasn't even a vessel designed for battle. But its mere presence sent a shock through the colony's survivors. It was human Earth's response, and more importantly, it carried the only hope they had left. As the ship descended and landed amidst the rubble, the last of the Xeric forces paused in confusion. The sight of the new arrivals was not what they had expected. Out of the ship's ramp stepped the Deathworlders, a group of men and women who seemed almost out of place amidst the destruction. They wore minimal armor, just enough to protect them from the hostile environment, but nothing that looked like the advanced weapons the Xerac relied on. Their faces were hardened, their eyes cold and sharp, their movements deliberate. The colony's defenders stared in awe. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were survivors made of something different, something the Zarek had never seen before. The Zarek, arrogantly sure of their superiority, took one glance at the new arrivals and dismissed them with a sneer. To them, the humans were just another primitive species. They thought little of their strength or resilience. What could these seemingly ragtag humans do in the face of such overwhelming power? The Zarek saw them as no threat, merely a distraction that would fall in the wake of their might. But Commander Jacob Hart and his team knew exactly what they were up against, and they weren't about to be underestimated. Hart, ever the strategist, surveyed the battlefield with a calm, calculated eye. He saw the massive Zarek warships overhead, their intimidating weapons already aiming to level the remaining defenses of the colony. He saw the desperate faces of the human survivors, and he saw opportunity. The Zarek might have technology that could vaporize cities. They didn't have what the Deathworlders had: the experience of surviving the unforgiving brutality of Earth's most hostile environments. Hart knew how to fight in terrain that could kill with a single misstep. He was about to use that to his advantage. With a quick hand signal, the team sprang into action. While the Zarek continued to underestimate the humans, they were not prepared for the speed and precision of the Deathworlders. In a blur of movement, Hart's team began fortifying the colony's remaining defenses, not with high-tech weapons, but with the natural environment itself. They used the land as their ally, manipulating every corner of the terrain. The humans had long ago learned how to fight in hostile ecosystems. Earth's Deathworlds and that same knowledge now proved invaluable. The Deathworlders worked quickly. They set traps and used the crumbling remains of buildings to create false positions, luring Zarek forces into kill zones. They dug pits, camouflaged them with local flora, and placed simple but highly effective explosive devices that would destroy enemy equipment when triggered. The Zarek focused on taking out the most obvious threats. The Deathworlders used the confusion to sabotage their war machines. It was a guerrilla war, but with a sophistication the Zarek were not prepared for. In the distance, Zarek troops began to advance, confident that the remaining human resistance would crumble beneath their firepower. They didn't know that every step they took was part of a larger trap. As they approached what seemed like an abandoned defensive post, they were greeted by a sudden eruption of gunfire and explosions, sending shockwaves through their ranks. The Deathworlders had used the Zarek's arrogance to turn the tables on them. With their advanced technology, the Zarek had assumed they could dominate any battlefield. But they had never faced an enemy that knew how to turn the land itself into a weapon. Hart, with his deep knowledge of tactics, directed his team to exploit the Zarek's weaknesses. They used their surroundings, shattered walls, abandoned vehicles, even the very dust in the air to conceal their movements. The Zarek's heavy weaponry could obliterate large groups, but it couldn't account for the sheer unpredictability of human ingenuity. Where the Zarek expected a direct confrontation, they found only confusion. Where they thought they had trapped their enemies, the Deathworlders had already set up their next ambush. The battle raged on for hours, the ground shaking under the might of the Zarek's weaponry. But the humans fought on, pushing back in ways the invaders could never have predicted. Every corner, every dark alley, every destroyed building became a deadly arena where the Deathworlders used their resourcefulness and knowledge of hostile terrain to level the playing field. The Zarek, for the first time, began to feel the sting of uncertainty. They had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated Earth. As the sun began to set, the Zarek forces faltered. Their relentless advance had slowed, then halted. In the midst of the chaos, the Zarek commanders realized they were facing something more dangerous than they had imagined: a species that, against all odds, had learned to survive in the face of extinction and had brought that same survival instinct to the battlefield. The humans were not giving up. And in that moment, the Zarek realized that this battle was far from over. The Deathworlders were not going to let them win. The battle for New Dawn was far from over. But a new rhythm had begun to emerge, one that the Zarek had not anticipated. Commander Jacob Hart, standing amidst the chaos, had led his team into the heart of the fight with a singular purpose: to turn the tide. And turn it they did. Despite being vastly outgunned and outnumbered, the Deathworlders had quickly proven that they were not just survivors. They were predators in their own right, adapting faster than any other species could have predicted. The Zarek's overwhelming technology and firepower were formidable, but the Deathworlders were playing a different kind of game, a game that Zarek had never learned to play. Using their intimate knowledge of Earth's Deathworlds, the Deathworlders had turned New Dawn's hostile terrain into a weapon. With every move, they exploited the Zarek's overconfidence, their reliance on brute force, and their inability to adapt to guerrilla tactics. Zarek, who had always been accustomed to dominating their enemies through sheer strength, found themselves facing an unpredictable and relentless assault. Hart's team used the alien environment to their advantage, making every corner of the battlefield a trap for their enemies. In a dense fog of smoke and dust, hidden mines, snare traps, and improvised explosives tore through Zarek ranks, sowing confusion and chaos among their forces. The Zarek's advanced weaponry could level entire buildings, but it couldn't cope with the cunning and resourcefulness of the Deathworlders. But the most significant blow came when when Deathworlders set their sights on the Zarek's greatest weapon: their warships. These ships, capable of decimating entire cities, were the heart of the Zarek offensive. The humans had no equivalent, but they had something far more dangerous: ingenuity. Using only rudimentary tools that would seem laughable to any species with advanced technology, the Deathworlders managed to infiltrate the belly of one of the Zarek warships. They didn't need to destroy it with brute force. Instead, they used their knowledge of sabotage and survival to disable the warship's power grid. The Zarek, accustomed to dealing with technological warfare, had never considered that a group of humans armed with nothing more than basic tools and sheer will could bring down one of their most powerful assets. The explosion was not massive, but the shockwave that followed sent ripples of panic through the Zarek ranks. The ship's power flickered and died, and with it, a key part of their offensive capability. The Zarek had always relied on their overwhelming force to win battles, but they had never expected an enemy that fought with such tenacity and adaptability. The Zarek were used to fighting in predictable, linear wars, where their technology was the final word. But the Deathworlders had turned everything the Zarek knew about warfare on its head. They were now fighting a war of attrition, one that the Zarek weren't prepared for. The humans had shown that they were not simply waiting to be destroyed. They were actively taking the fight to their enemies. As the Deathworlders continued to push the Zarek back, Commander Hart knew that this could not be won through conventional means. The battle would not be decided by who had the bigger guns or more advanced ships. It would be decided by who had the better will to survive. And on Earth, survival was something humans had perfected over millennia. They had lived through wars, famine, and disasters, and they had learned how to outlast their enemies. The Deathworlders embodied this survival instinct, and it was now their most powerful weapon. Hart knew that to truly break the Zarek's momentum, they would need to hit the heart of their operation, their command center. It was a heavily fortified facility deep behind enemy lines, but the Deathworlders were not deterred. They had been trained to infiltrate enemy strongholds, to move through enemy territory unnoticed, and to strike without mercy. The mission was dangerous, but there was no other choice. If they could disable the Zarek's central command, it would throw their entire operation into disarray. With no leadership, the Zarek forces would collapse under their own weight. Deathworlders moved like shadows, slipping through the night as the Zarek forces scrambled to regroup. They avoided the main roads, using the natural landscape to cover their movements. They scaled cliffs, crossed narrow ravines, and threaded through dense forests all without making a sound. It was a perilous mission, but to the Deathworlders, this was second nature. They had faced far worse environments on Earth, and they had survived. Now, the Zarek would face the same relentless ingenuity. Once inside the Zarek's main command center, the team wasted no time. They knew that speed was crucial. They planted explosive charges on the critical infrastructure, the communication arrays, the power systems, and the main data hubs. Every action was precise, calculated, and swift. They used the Zarek's own technology against them, turning their advanced systems into tools of destruction. The Zarek had built a fortress, but the Deathworlders had come to tear it down. The Zarek, still reeling from the loss of their warship, suddenly found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts. The power grid failed, the communications network was disrupted, and the Zarek commanders were left scrambling to figure out what had happened. In the chaos, panic spread through the ranks. The Zarek, once so confident in their superiority, were now beginning to realize that this human force was unlike any they had encountered before. The Deathworlders didn't need numbers. They didn't need technology. They needed only their wits and their will to survive. And that was more than enough to start turning the tide as the last of the explosives went off. Hart stood at the center of the now darkened command room, a grim smile on his face. The battle had shifted. The Zarek had underestimated humanity before, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The tide of the war had turned, and this time it was humanity's turn to dictate the terms of the fight. The Deathworlders had shown that Earth was not a world to be trifled with, and the Zarek had learned the hard way that human determination could not be crushed. The war was far from over. But for the first time, the Zarek could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The Deathworlders had come, and they were not going to let New Dawn fall without a fight. The final battle had come. The once proud colony of New Dawn, now a shadow of its former self, braced for the storm that was about to descend upon it. Zarek, after weeks of heavy losses, had regrouped and were preparing for one final, crushing assault. Their mothership, a behemoth of firepower and overwhelming technology, had finally arrived in orbit. The invaders intended to wipe out every trace of humanity's presence on this planet, erasing the last hope of the human race in the sector. The Zarek forces had been relentless, but now they were closing in for the kill. The human survivors, led by the Deathworlders, had endured the worst the Zarek could throw at them. Now they faced their final test. Commander Jacob Hart, standing amidst the battered remnants of New Dawn's defenses, could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. The Zarek had underestimated them before, but now the humans knew what they were up against, an enemy capable of unimaginable destruction. Yet Hart had never once wavered in his belief that humanity could survive. The Deathworlders had lived through Earth's deadliest environments. They'd seen the worst of nature and war, and they had survived. This fight would be no different. The humans had lost many in the previous days. Some had died in the initial assault, while others had fallen in the brutal skirmishes that followed. But now they were united not just by the need to survive, but by a bond that the Zarek could never understand. Humanity had something that the Zarek could not replicate: unity, determination, and an unyielding will to live. These were not just soldiers. They were Earth's finest survivors, each one willing to lay down their life for something greater than themselves. And that Hart knew was humanity's greatest weapon. The Zarek forces launched their final assault with all the firepower they had left. The ground shook with each blast, as the massive warships above pounded the surface with their devastating energy weapons. Buildings crumbled, and the colony's remaining defenses were obliterated in moments. Yet amidst the smoke and destruction, the Deathworlders moved with a calm purpose. They had faced worse and had learned how to fight back. Hart's team, hardened by their training and survival instincts, had become a force to be reckoned with. As the Zarek advanced, they set traps, used the wreckage to their advantage, and continued to strike with precision. They were not just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to send a message, and that message was about to be sent in the most direct way possible. Hart knew that the key to ending the war lay in crippling the Zarek's mothership. With its massive weaponry and command center, it controlled the entire Zarek operation. Taking it down was humanity's only chance at victory. The Deathworlders had already infiltrated enemy positions, sabotaged their tech, and disrupted their communications. Now, they would make their final move. The infiltration mission was set into motion with lethal precision. Hart and his team infiltrated the Zarek mothership under the cover of darkness. The enemy's arrogance worked to their advantage. They believed the Deathworlders to be no more than an annoyance. What they did not account for was human ingenuity. The team moved through the ship with unmatched stealth, using whatever resources they had at their disposal to disable enemy security systems and avoid detection. They relied on nothing but their instincts and the training they had received in the harshest environments on Earth. The deeper they went into the mothership, the more the Zarek began to realize that something was amiss. Their once imposing fortress was no longer impenetrable. The Deathworlders had made it past their best defenses. With a sense of urgency mounting, Hart gave the order to plant the explosive charges deep within the ship's core near the reactor that powered the entire vessel. They had to hit the heart of the beast if they wanted to ensure the Zarek couldn't fight back. The Deathworlders worked quickly but methodically, planting charges at strategic points throughout the ship. As they prepared to make their exit, the Zarek launched a last-ditch counterattack, but it was too late. The human team had already set the stage for their escape. As the countdown to detonation began, the team fought their way back to the surface. The Zarek, realizing too late what had happened, tried to retaliate, but the humans were always one step ahead, using the ship's own labyrinthine corridors to stay one step ahead of their would-be captors. With seconds to spare, Hart and his team made their way to an escape pod. The final explosion was deafening. The mothership erupted in a blinding flash of light, sending shockwaves through the surrounding area. The sound of the Zarek's greatest weapon crumbling to dust reverberated through the entire sector, and with it, the invaders' hopes of total domination as the Deathworlders watched. From a safe distance, they saw the Zarek forces in disarray. Their command structure had been obliterated, their morale shattered. With the mothership gone, the Zarek began to retreat, unsure of what to do next. It was a humiliating defeat, a blow from which they would not recover. Humanity had shown that they were not a species to be taken lightly. They had fought back and won against all odds, using nothing but their will to survive and the power of unity. The battle was over. The Zarek were forced to retreat, their once imposing forces scattering across the stars. The human colony of New Dawn had been saved, but more importantly, Earth's message had been sent across the galaxy. Humanity was no longer just a species fighting for survival. They had proven that they could not be crushed, no matter the odds. Earth's Deathworlders had shown the galaxy that, in the face of unimaginable adversity, humans would always rise up. And for the Zarek and any other invaders that might come next, that message would echo throughout the stars for generations to come. Humanity had survived, and they would continue to survive no matter the cost.